everyone, and welcome in to Perspective. We're continuing with the home edition, just on the side of safety because of the pandemic, of course. And I've got a couple of segments today I think you're going to get some great information from. First of all, there's a lady in the studio named Kim Teehee, or Teehee. She's the nation's delegate to Congress for the Cherokee Nation. Kim, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're also a graduate of RSU, are you not?
I am.
Got to sound that out. Get a plug in there for the school.
Absolutely. I'm an alum of Rogers State.
Tell me and tell the folks at home, what is Cherokee Nation's delegate to Congress? What is that all about?
Well, what it's all about is the United States fulfilling a treaty right. A treaty from 1835, which is the Cherokee Nation's removal treaty, the Treaty of New Echota, that includes in it a provision that allows Cherokee Nation to have a delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives whenever Congress makes provision for the same. Those are the exact words. It's very clear, it's crystal clear. It's a treaty right that's never been fulfilled, and it's a treaty right that we've not ever asserted. The chief of the Cherokee Nation actually didn't have the legal authority within our own nation until the 2000s, when in our Constitution, the chief was finally given the authority to appoint a delegate and for the Council of the Nation, which is our legislative body, to confirm the delegate. This treaty right has never been abrogated. It's still the supreme law of the land, and our hope is that Congress or the House of Representatives will seat the delegate. The delegate would be pretty similar to a non-voting delegate of U.S. territories. And the non-voting status basically means that the delegate does not vote on the House floor, but the delegate can introduce legislation, amend legislation, rise in leadership, chair committees, vote in committee, amend their bills, debate the bills on the House floor, just can't vote on the House floor. And so that's essentially what it is.
So you're right in the thrust of the infighting up there, aren't you? Well, I don't envy you that. You're also director of government relations for the Cherokee Nation. How is that different from being the nation's delegate to Congress?
Well, first of all, the delegate to Congress is a treaty-based position, and it's one that our own tribal constitution contemplates to be seated in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so it's a dignitary status. I make it akin to a U.S. ambassador. For example, U.S. ambassadors are appointed by the President of the United States. They're confirmed by the Senate, and they represent the nation before other governments. And in my case, it would be the House of Representatives. My job at Cherokee Nation, overseeing the government relations, really is outside of that body. I'm not actually within the body of the Congress or the state legislature for that matter. And so I'm working as a constituent. And I'm working on behalf of a nation to help oversee and monitor our interests before the federal body, agencies, and Congress, and in the state as well.
I'm a little curious about something with the chief. I got to tell you, I'm so impressed with this guy, the moves he's made, and let me just pause right there. I want to go back briefly when you were just a child. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ross Swimmer was chief at the time, had to do with the gravel in the Arkansas River, which, boy, the Cherokee Nation stood up to Congress and said, that's ours. Mm-hmm. And by golly, when the smoke blew away, they officially acknowledged it. It may have been Wilma, but I think it was Ross Swimmer who was chief at the time. Now, the chief of the Cherokees has proven his mettle to me and to everybody else by saying, you know what, we're going to move to a smaller carbon footprint. And he's got 3 buses now that are electric. How did that come about?
Well, as you know, Earth Day is this week. And so the chief and many of the staff and frankly many of our citizens are taking great steps to reduce their carbon footprint. And so we had a grant from the Department of Transportation, and our transportation folks have for some time now been putting this in motion, where we were able to acquire buses and develop the stations to charge those buses and to make a plan to provide critical transportation to our citizens. And so this week we unveiled and rolled out those buses to reduce that carbon footprint. And we're doing our part to be responsible citizens to make sure that the future generation has Mother Earth the way it was intended to be.
Boy, listen, going to have to be a lot of changes. You see what's happening with the weather. Well, anyway, hats off and applause to the chief, and you please pass that on. I'm so proud to know him and to know that he's taken the lead on this, and he's got a lot of fine people around him too. So that makes a lot of us proud. If Will Rogers were sitting with me today, he'd want to interrupt and say, now tell me, Kim, why do you want to be involved in government on any level? That had to be a goal for you starting a long time ago, didn't it?
It did, and my own personal history is so intertwined with federal law and federal policies that I became curious about why my parents went to an Indian boarding school, about why the land on which my parents were raised, both of them, is different from other land. What boarding schools were, what it was designed to do, why I was born in Chicago, why my parents went to Chicago as part of the federal relocation program. There are so many federal policies that they didn't realize they were living through, and it all began with that Treaty of New Echota. We had earlier treaties too, but that's the treaty that forced the removal of our people from the east to the west, to today Oklahoma. And we had a quarter of our population who died on that trail. And things didn't stop there. You mentioned Chief Swimmer and Chief Mankiller, who led the nation in the 80s. And they did so many things. And Cherokees have a long history of fighting for our rights, not just for the Arkansas riverbed that you mentioned, in which Congress addressed in legislation, but it was also addressed in the courts. We have a long history in this country of defending our rights and for asserting our rights and for standing up for ourselves. And you're right about Chief Hoskin. He is very progressive, and he believes in the law of the land. And he believes, when he was Secretary of State, not when he was chief, that the United States should honor its treaty right and fulfill this 1835 Treaty of New Echota. It's literally, quite literally, blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors who died, and this would give some small measure of justice for the citizens of the nation if the United States honored this particular treaty right and seated the delegate.
One of the things I admire about him too, I'll just mention this and get on back to what we were talking about. He's quiet. I don't think the man has a temper, and if he does, he never shows it, but he listens when other people talk. Boy, what a great trait that is in any individual this day and age. Anyway, the nation is really coming along. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, and you correct me here if I'm wrong, but didn't the move toward business really get underway back when they started with plants and nurseries and all that sort of thing? Isn't that how it kind of got its start?
Well, Sam, if you look at the modern history of the Cherokee Nation, Congress had a big role here. We didn't start, a congressional act authorized the Cherokee Nation to once again start electing our principal chiefs in the mid-70s. Since the mid-70s, Chief Hoskin is the 8th chief of the Cherokee Nation. And so if you'll notice, the one chief after the other was building a foundation for the next chief to build upon. And so, in the 80s, you could say Chief Mankiller began with the bingo operation. In the 70s, before that, we had grants. It was the era of self-determination, and we were rebuilding a nation that had been so critically damaged by acts of Congress and because of those treaties and such. And so we have been so focused on rebuilding the nation and one chief after the next, building a foundation where we finally are able to, go after a treaty right that was long promised to us. And Chief Hoskin has taken the reins, and he's running with it. He's doing these wonderful things and making sure that our healthcare systems are running effectively, and he's leading in the most progressive way possible on how we respond to COVID. I challenge you to find any leader who has done what he has done to make sure our citizens are protected, to make sure our language is preserved by prioritizing Cherokee First Language speakers with healthcare frontline workers, so that we preserve something that's so precious to us as a people and as our culture. And so I'm very proud of the things that he's done during this pandemic. You know, he's led, and he's a strong leader. You know, and I'm just like you said. The foundations, going back to the chiefs of the past. I look to Wilma Mankiller because she was my mentor. I was her intern, and I see what she started for the nation. We just celebrated the 40th anniversary of something she started that dealt with infrastructure. It was providing,
is that right?
it was providing a water pipeline to the community of Bell in
Yep.
Stillwell, Oklahoma. That catapulted her up into national attention and fame. But those pipelines are 40 years old now. And so Chief Hoskin is working closely with Congress on an infrastructure package to make sure water systems, water infrastructure are provided for in the infrastructure package that's been unveiled by President Biden. Because he's still building on that foundation. Look, it's hard to celebrate something that was so great and so innovative in its time, but we have to
I
keep up
know.
with those systems.
And you know, Wilma was a very good friend of mine, and a spiritual guide, if you will. We used to sit with my wife and I, with she and Charlie Soap, her husband, and swap war stories, if you will. I don't think the average Oklahoman has any concept of what any tribe went through on the Trail of Tears. I know they think they do, but I don't think they really have a good handle on it. Kim, we just got a little bit of time left. Is there something you can share with us that may be lurking in the future, some kind of a special project that you're involved in?
Seating the delegate, that is it. You know, during COVID, even though March of 2020 was our last visit to DC, where we had great momentum, and we had to shift our focus to working with Congress to make sure that that tribes were included in the stimulus packages, and making sure that, you know, once we got those federal dollars, that Chief and others of his cabinet were able to make a plan in working with our tribal council to distribute it and to tend to the needs of our citizens. And so,
Well, I know for a fact, if Wilma was your mentor, that her spirit's somewhere around you as we speak.
absolutely.
And she's got a big smile on her face, and she's saying, "Go, girl,
Absolutely.
go."
She was
I
always
mean,
up,
she was,
always lifted up women. When I lived in D.C. for nearly 20 years, and she was visiting in New York, she would
yeah.
always invite me. I would go to Gloria Steinem's house and visit with she and Wilma. And absolutely, and Wilma was a great defender of tribal rights, of tribal treaty rights, and
Well, it's
absolutely,
so
she would be
good to
very
see
proud of the nation today.
the strength of the Cherokee Nation government. Hey, Kim, thank you for coming in, and we'd like to have you back maybe down the road if you have
Sure,
time.
absolutely, my
All
pleasure.
right, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and
Take
my
care.
best to the chief.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a short break, folks, and we'll be back with more right after this.